Thank you so much, Donna. I think the summary is I've been around the block and I'm old. So, but thank you for that, and thanks for inviting me to speak. Nothing pleases me more than to speak about Active Directory and security. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think, based on the activity that I've seen, especially over the last 6 to 9 months, this is on the forefront of everyone's mind, and for good reason. I hope that I'm going to fill in some gaps for those of you that are pretty in tune with AD, and for those of you that are wondering where AD fits within these attacks. Hopefully, I can fill in those gaps and kind of show you the importance of AD to these attackers. And we also need to talk about the entire attack strategy the attackers are taking, because we have to secure not only Active Directory, but in every possible way our entry points. And so we'll kind of walk through that path together today. For those of you that maybe haven't heard me speak before, what I like to do is kind of talk about building blocks to begin with, and then from there, put those building blocks together. So that way we can actually get further down the road in a short amount of time. I think Donna covered most of the things on here. I actually went into the archive and pulled out this pretty old Server 2003 book, obviously that I wrote quite a while ago, almost 20 years. And those of you that might have this resource kit, the group policy resource kit on your desk, I worked on that as well with the group policy team at Microsoft. So definitely have some books out there. As you probably know, the first 12 years of 2000, no one really cared about security. But now it's on the forefront of everyone's mind. And it's certainly something that I focus on. I will mention now and at the end, please, if you have any questions, email me. Use me as a resource. I didn't get 17 MVPs from Microsoft because I didn't help the community. It's really what my passion is. So please utilize me. It doesn't have to be about the topic. If it's something else you're struggling with group policy or Active Directory or something, ping me. If I don't know the answer, hopefully I can track it down with someone else that I know that might know the answer. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of information about me. And let's jump into our material. And what I want to do is I want to talk about, as I kind of mentioned, the makeup of an attack, right? And then we need to talk about, how important is Active Directory to the attacker? Because we don't just want to look at this in an isolated view. We really want to make sure that we are looking at the reality of what's happening so that we can, in the end, make sure that we are focusing on the right areas. And then I want to talk about how we can secure entry points in Active Directory. So what is the makeup of an attack? Well, I'm going to actually leverage the MITRE ATT&CK framework for this. And you'll see that I've kind of created a timeline per se of what the attacker does before they attack, as well as what the attacker does to move through the environment. Because even though an attacker compromises a single device, that doesn't immediately get them to the content that they need, right? So the attacker has to somehow get from where they enter to their main goal. And that may not be a straight line, right? The attacker never knows how to go from where they enter to what they need. But let's talk about a couple of things that are for certain. In the middle, you see a list of tactics that the attackers use to move through the environment. This is not a list of do this first, do this second, not that at all. It's actually just a list, because the attacker has to be very dynamic. The attacker never knows the operating system, applications, the device. It doesn't know anything about what's going on. So the attacker, once they get onto a device, has to take actions to make sure that they aren't seen, right? So they're going to evade defenses. They're going to discover information about that machine, right? Maybe it's got certain vulnerabilities. Maybe it's running a VPN so they can take advantage of misconfigurations. They need to download bits and pieces to this device, so they need to get privilege escalation on that device. all of these things are in the mind of the attacker. They just don't know how they're going to get there. So they have to, evaluate, analyze, and then attack. The other thing that I can absolutely say, based on all of the information that's been posted and the information that we've gathered, to go from the delivery to this execution and maintaining of persistence, the attackers are using Active Directory in between. It is the one certainty that's typically going to be there, and it's the certainty that the attacker is going to be able to exploit something in Active Directory. Now, along the way, the attacker is going to utilize Active Directory, utilize devices, services, applications. And the other thing that we've seen is there's two ways for the attacker to move through the environment. One, exploit vulnerabilities, and two, exploit configurations that are weak. We call them misconfigurations. Those are the two absolute certainties. So if there's nothing else that we need to take from this, we have to patch, right? How many years have been hearing patch, 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 right? Well, guess what? We're not patching enough because the attackers are leveraging and exploiting our vulnerabilities. Two, configurations. Think of all the devices, all of the applications, all of the services within your environment that have configurations. There's a lot, right? A lot. There's also a lot of areas for vulnerabilities. The one thing that we have to keep in mind is you can't patch everything and you can't configure everything tight as possible. So what we need to do is prioritize. We absolutely need to prioritize. We know which vulnerabilities the attackers are going after most of the time. We know what configurations the attackers are going after most of the time. So what we need to do is play match game and make sure that we match what we're patching and configuring is what the attacker is going after. Then we can start looking at the other areas that they might be looking at if they don't have these easy and known vulnerabilities and configurations. In the end, the attacker wants privileged accounts. Now, getting the privileged accounts, as we're going to see, isn't that difficult. Getting the passwords for those accounts might be a little more difficult, but again, I'm going to show you the process that the attacker takes to obtain privileged accounts and their passwords. Now, if the attacker can get a privileged account and its password, they have what they need. And that's when they're going to launch even more advanced attacks that create backdoors, allowing persistence in the environment. So there's a lot of moving parts, okay? It's not linear. It's not something simple. Certainly the attacker has a lot that they have to do to get in and move through the environment. Our job is to make it more complex and almost impossible for them to do that, okay? Now, what the attacker is doing for AD is specifically they're enumerating Active Directory and all the possible settings. It's not every setting, because with read access, which is what they have at this point, they can't get password hashes per se, right? They can't do that. But what they can do is they can enumerate all of the other pieces. Now, let me give you some examples of what that might look like. They could enumerate all of the privileged groups and the group's users that have membership in those groups. They could get a list of every domain controller. They can get a list of all the trust relationships, group policy settings. All of these areas are areas that they can analyze to find the easiest target. And that's what they want to do. You know, I read a lot of information that's published. And when I read, oh, it was a sophisticated attack, it was a nation state attack, I'd have to see more detail to prove that, right? Most attacks aren't nation state or sophisticated. Most attacks are actually pretty basic, okay? Especially those against Active Directory. Right? To prove that, over the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to spend some time with different pen testers. And I always ask the pen tester, right? What percentage of time Do you target Active Directory once you have a foothold in the environment? Over the last couple of weeks, every pen tester told me it's over 90%. Okay. Then I ask, okay, of those times when you are querying and enumerating Active Directory, looking for areas to get in, what percentage of time can you get into Active Directory pretty easily? That number is again over 90%. So that means that it is nearly overall 90% of the time that Active Directory can be leveraged. And when the attacker leverages AD, they're trying to either not log information on domain controllers or confuse the logs. What does confuse the logs mean? Well, a couple of the things that I'm going to show you as we move through this discussion is the attackers can impersonate accounts. Well, if there's an account, let's say there's a service account that is constantly authenticating to multiple machines, so its information is going through the logs. Well, if someone impersonates that account and they're performing actions, now there's just more activity for an existing account that's real. When the SOC analyst gets that information, how can they determine the difference between good and bad behavior? Very difficult to do that, okay? So the attackers know what they want to do, and they're leveraging it. So they enumerate AD, they go after the low-hanging fruit, and they try to not be detected. And that's really what the attacker is doing. Now, again, I have my own views on this, but let's look at some reality of how important Active Directory is to the attacker, right? I have a couple of examples for you here. First of all, we have an analysis done by FireEye on the SolarWinds attack code. Inside of the SolarWinds code that attacked it, the code would basically query the existing device that was compromised to determine if it was joined to Active Directory. If it was, the attack continued on that device. If the device isn't part of Active Directory, it ceased the attack on that device and moved to the next device. That speaks loudly of how important Active Directory is to the SolarWinds attack. You can also say, because of this logic, every SolarWinds breach included Active Directory. Okay, the same with the ZingLocker, right? It's the third variant of Mount Locker. It has a similar check. The currently compromised computer is checked to see if it's joined to an Active Directory domain. If it isn't, the ransomware fails on that device. Now, again, I can't give you two better examples of the importance that Active Directory has on these attacks. Attackers know where they can enumerate AD and find attack paths directly into the Active Directory domain at a privileged level. This is clear indication of that. The pen testers are a clear indication of that. And what we're seeing based on the number of breaches, I actually start losing count of all of the huge organizations that are breached because there's so many of them. And at the core, AD has to be involved in some point, right? It may not be that they got the keys to the kingdom and then we're able to do everything they want, but it really sends the attacker directly into even more of the enterprise once they get AD credentials. So what are the steps to secure entry points in Active Directory? Well, let's first of all talk about really kind of the entry point as well as lateral movement with regard to vulnerabilities. You will see that the vulnerabilities have increased year after year. That there's no denying that, okay? But what is absolutely certain is the number of vulnerabilities which have the high probability of being leveraged in an attack, is very low. So even though the number is growing, the actual vulnerabilities that we have to give our attention to is a very small subset. So you don't have to patch everything, right? And that's why we focus on a priority rating, right? If we can give a priority rating to vulnerabilities, float the highest ratings to the top, that will give you a clear indication of what you need to patch immediately, okay? Because what we want to do is reduce the attack surface. And if we can reduce our attack surface with vulnerabilities from the size of a football field down to a postage stamp by only focusing on 3% of vulnerabilities, that's a pretty powerful outcome. So again, this is at the entry point as well as everywhere in your environment, because one of the two ways that the attacker moves through the environment is taking advantage of vulnerabilities. Now, the other thing that we need to do is we need to secure Active Directory. Now, Active Directory doesn't have a lot of vulnerabilities. There are some, there absolutely are some, there's a handful. But most of the issues in Active Directory are around configurations. Why is that the case? Well, inside of Active Directory, you have a lot of moving parts. Those moving parts, in order for things to function, the settings have to be there. You can't just get rid of the setting and have Active Directory continue to function or services continue to function. So the unfortunate thing with Active Directory is the setting must be there. So what we need to do is uncover the settings that have a security issue related to them and determine if we can make that setting more secure. Therefore, we reduce the attack surface on Active Directory, just like we did with vulnerabilities. But we're focusing on the configurations more, right? Just like the entry points might be a configuration issue, we need to worry about both of them, both sides of the vulnerability and misconfiguration issue. So when we're talking about AD, there are three primary steps that we absolutely need to take. First, you need to fix what you have. Doesn't matter if you have a single forest, single domain, or 10 forests and 100 domains. You got to secure what you have. Because if you just move forward from where you are and don't secure what you have, you're not fixing the underlying issue. Any attacker could enumerate AD and leverage these settings that need to be secured. So we need to take these actions. Now, what I find is many organizations do this to a certain level, right? They'll bring in pen testers, they'll do an audit, they'll do an assessment. They'll clean up AD to a certain point, and then they move to the next project. Well, guess what? We have a statement here at Tenable: drift happens, right? Especially in AD. Every day, things are changing within Active Directory. We have humans, right, changing AD. We have PowerShell changing AD. We have third-party tools. We have scripts. We have scheduled tasks. Lots of things are changing AD. How in the world are you going to constantly ensure that a change didn't open up a new attack path into AD? Well, that's what you need to do. You need to maintain this hardened level of security, okay? Both of these first two steps are all about prevention, right? Think about it as your own health, right? You take your vitamins every morning, you exercise, you eat healthy, all in the goal to not get sick. But guess what? We still get sick, right? Well, guess what? No matter what you prevent in AD, you still might be attacked. So we have to be able to detect attacks in real time, okay? Now, I go back to this list because this is where we can actually see what we need to secure within Active Directory. So let's take some steps, okay? First of all, lateral movement. Lateral movement is the idea that the attacker from their entry point now wants to move to other devices laterally and up through the environment. Couple of reasons they want to do this. First, they want to mine the credentials from every device they touch. Now, where are these credentials? Well, they're in the cache, right? It could be an application, could be a service, could be the browser, could be the operating system. Everything caches, right? It makes it easier on the end user. So the attacker needs privileges on that device so they can mine the credentials from that device. Now, if they only mine the username and a hash, how do they get the password? Well, that's where they use password attack technologies like brute forcing. In the end, the attacker is creating a master list of credentials. The more devices they touch, the bigger their list gets. At this point, it's just a list. They don't really know what any of those credentials can do, but we're going to get there. Okay, that's our next step. The other thing that the attacker wants to do once they get privileges on a device is they want to install software that they can then enumerate the environment. So how do we protect against these steps? Most of them with lateral movement is all about passwords. So first, implement LAPS, Local Administrator Password Solution, free technology from Microsoft. It's not ideal, but it really does a good core job of making sure that all the workstations, all the servers have a unique local administrator password. Okay, that's going to deny the easy hop from one device to the next. 2, teach your users not to reuse passwords or use common passwords. If nothing else, put technologies in place which deny them this. Okay. Implement multi-factor authentication. Make it so that it's not only the password, they have to break into something else. Okay. This will help the most with lateral movement. Next, and we're going to come back to this lateral movement because we have to talk about mined credentials. But next, the attacker is going to enumerate Active Directory. All right. Now, consider at this point, the attacker has privileges over an endpoint, and they have a list of credentials. They don't know what those credentials can do, but I guarantee one of those credentials has read access to Active Directory, and that's all they need. Yes, it's true. Attackers only need read access to enumerate Active Directory. Let me jump into the interface, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. This is Active Directory users and computers for my domain. I'm going to go to my domain node, and I'm going to come down here to properties. And you will see under security that authenticated users, which is every user in the domain, has read access. Look at that. Read access. Now, I was asked yesterday, well, Derek, can you deny them having read access and that would solve this? Yes and yes. Is it realistic? No. Okay. I'm going to say this twice so that no one does this. What I am showing you here, please do not do this in your production environment. Please do not click this deny and then apply. Do not. I'll say it again. Do not take authenticated users and deny them read access to the domain. You will destroy Active Directory, okay? Because this would include, first of all of your privileged users, and they would be denied read access. 2, it would break AD because users need to read different parts of Active Directory. I mean, if nothing else, they need to read policies. That's part of group policy. There are group policy settings stored in Active Directory. So when the user authenticates, they have to read what's here, okay? So it's not as easy as, oh, well, just, if this is the problem, fix it. You can't, okay? When the attacker enumerates AD, they are able to get a list of users that have access through access control lists, delegation. They're able to get a list of group members down to the user level, including domain admins, enterprise admins. They can get user rights. So after they enumerate Active Directory, the attacker has a second list of users. This is a list of users that have privileges. So they have the list from Lateral Movement. They have a list from enumerating AD. Now it's match game. If any of those users are on both lists, they now know a username and password that has a privilege in Active Directory. And if it's at the domain level, it's game over. It could be that simple. So what do you need to do? You need to secure privileged users. You need to secure service accounts. Well, what does that look like? Okay, let's jump back into AD and talk a little bit about what this might look like. First of all, make sure that your domain admins, enterprise admins, group policy creator owners, your administrators, account operators, backup operators, all of these groups have a very limited number of users, and the number of users is maintained. There's no drift here, okay? Also make sure that all of your accounts are secured. You have to make sure that the settings for these accounts aren't going to give the attacker privileges. Let me give you an example of that. Over here, I'm going to focus on Maximus, and I'm going to go to Maximus's attributes. First of all, Maximus is seen as an administrative account because admin count is equal to 1. 2, if I come down here to some settings, you will see that, first of all, Maximus has some service principal names. The primary group ID for Maximus is also an admin group. This is the level you need to live in. Okay, now, how easy is it going to be for you to look at the attributes for every user? Not easy at all. Even if you use PowerShell, it's not easy, which is why you need to think about using solutions that do this for you. Okay, solutions that allow you to see the security areas in your environment. This is showing me all of the issues with my domain. The domain I just showed you, all of the issues, okay? So right here, primary group ID. I just said that Maximus has a bad primary group ID, but so does Hercules, right? So these accounts have primary group IDs, which the attacker could immediately exploit. At this level, you need to be able to go in to these areas and make sure that you secure them, okay? Now, you also have to go in and look at enumeration of accounts that can be attacked as well as attacks themselves, okay? So settings that can be attacked would be users with SPNs. Attacks would include password spraying and brute force attacks, as well as DC Sync, DC Shadow, and Golden Ticket. If you're not familiar with these attacks, please go and do some read up on them. They're very difficult to detect. But that's where a solution like Tenable AD comes. They detect these attacks in real time. So we need to do 2 things. First of all, we need to secure our endpoints and AD from vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. And then we have to be able to maintain the security across the board. So that gives you an idea of what the issue is and where you can actually spend some time. So Donna, I know we went a little bit over on that. I don't know if we have one question we can handle, but if nothing else, if someone posted a question, I'm more than happy to answer those and send those out afterwards.
Sounds good. Thank you, Derek. I appreciate your time today. It was a great presentation. I'm just